Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Today's story takes us to a brutally cold Canadian winter, where a quiet neighborhood keeps waking up to the same problem over and over again. What starts as annoying late-night vandalism in a frozen back alley slowly turns into a lesson about patience, physics, and what happens when people stop cleaning up after someone else's bad decisions. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. He thought destroying city property was a game. We used a garden hose and an Arctic deep freeze to build a trap that rode off his car. The winter of 2004 in our corner of Edmonton didn't just arrive, it seized this city by the throat and refused to let go. It was a season of profound, crystalline silence, broken only by the groan of houses contracting in the cold and the distant, mournful whistle of freight trains pushing through the wide expanse beyond the city limits. Our lives contracted into small, warm pockets of light, and the world outside became a stark, beautiful, and hostile place. The back alleys that ran behind our rows of modest bungalows, normally summer shortcuts for kids and delivery drivers, transformed into wind-whipped tunnels of packed snow and grimy ice. And it was here in this frozen utilitarian space that our quiet neighborhood staged its own peculiar frostbitten revolt. The protagonists of this drama were the municipal garbage bins, hulking barrel-shaped things of thick yellow plastic. They stood like patient, ugly sentinels at regular intervals down the alley. Every Thursday morning, a great orange truck with its grinding hydraulic arm would perform its weekly ritual, swallowing our collective waste with a cacophony of crashing plastic. For the other 6 days, the bins just sat inert and ignored. My house sat a block down the alley from the Aviator, a bar whose flickering neon sign, a stylized pilot's goggles, cast a sickly, buzzing glow in the snow. The Aviator was the kind of place with sticky floors, a perpetually dim ambiance, and a clientele whose hopes seemed to have been permanently grounded. And every few weeks, like a symptom of the bar's melancholy, the alley would bear the brunt of a departing patron's poor judgment. The pattern was infuriatingly consistent. I'd wake up, brew my coffee in the pre-dawn dark, and glance out the kitchen window to see the aftermath. A bin would be toppled, its contents, coffee grounds, diapers, shredded bills, spilled across the ice like a shameful secret. Another would be shoved several feet out of alignment, a long black tire scar burned into its yellow side. The culprit was never in doubt. It was someone in a beat-up car leaving the Aviator after last call, who found the narrow alley more amusing as an obstacle course than a thoroughfare. You could almost taste the cheap beer and stupid laughter in the frozen air the next morning. "Third time this month," grumbled Leo, my next-door neighbor, as we righted a heavy bin one bitter morning in late November. He was a retired machinist, a man whose hands were mapped with fine, silvery scars from a lifetime of precision work. Disorder offended him. "City's gonna slap a new one here, wasted taxpayer money." "You ever catch anyone?" I asked, kicking a clump of frozen spaghetti back toward the bin. "What for?" Leo snorted, his breath a thick plume. "Property damage to a city bin? It's a parking ticket at best. They don't care." He was right. The city workers, when they eventually arrived, would just sigh, haul away the cracked carcass, and drop a new, bright yellow bin with a hollow thud. But there was a bureaucratic lag, a week, sometimes two, where we'd have to haul our garbage bags farther down the alley, a minor pilgrimage made miserable by the biting wind. As December bled into January, the cold turned aggressive. The kind of cold that makes car engines shriek in protest and battery cables snap like dry twigs. The plastic of the bins changed too. It lost whatever flexibility it had, becoming brittle and unforgiving. Where a summer hit might have left a scuff, a winter impact now caused catastrophic failure. A bin would be split open, a jagged crack running from rim to base, or have an entire side stoved in. The replacements became more frequent. The alley began to resemble a plastic battlefield littered with the shards of fallen soldiers. Then came the deep freeze. The weatherman on CBC delivered the news with gravitas. "A mass of Arctic air is settling over the province. Expect overnight lows near -40 for the next several days." The temperature's a great equalizer. It's where the scales meet and agree. It's simply, purely fatal cold. The world hushed. Sounds became muffled, isolated. The snow underfoot squeaked like polystyrene. The morning after the first -40-degree night, the destruction was apocalyptic. 2 bins were utterly obliterated, shattered into countless yellow fragments scattered across the ice like grotesque confetti. A third had a perfect tire-size hole punched through its middle. It wasn't mischief anymore, it was vandalism with a vehicular weapon. Leo was already outside, standing amidst the wreckage with his arms crossed, not shivering. He seemed to be absorbing the cold, letting it fuel a slow, quiet fire inside. "It's the Buick," he said, not looking at me. "Maroon, mid-'80s LeSabre. Rust over the rear wheel well. I saw it peeling out last night." "We should call it in," I said, though we both knew the futility. "They'll say it's a civil matter," Leo replied. He finally turned, and his eyes, usually a calm blue, were the color of the winter sky just before a storm. "Civil matter. My grandmother's rolling pin was a civil matter. This," he kicked a piece of plastic, "is just physics. Brittle plastic, kinetic energy." He stared at the remaining intact bin at the alley's mouth, closest to the aviator. "But you know what has interesting physical properties at this temperature?" I waited. "Water," he said, the word hanging in the air between us like a promise. He turned and walked back to his garage, not waiting for a reply. The plan was never verbalized. It was an understanding, born of shared frustration and the unique problem-solving mindset of a man who'd spent 40 years making parts fit. The next evening, as the sun fled the sky and the terrible cold descended again, I saw Leo in his garage. He had an old garden hose connected to his hot water tank outlet, the other end snaking out towards the alley. He gave me a curt, almost imperceptible nod. I nodded back. That was the entire conference. The following morning, the bin was transformed. It wasn't just standing, it possessed a new, dense authority. A thick, translucent collar of ice, like a glacier's toe, bulged from its rim and fused it to the asphalt. Someone, and none of the neighbors I asked over the next few days would admit to seeing a thing, had filled it nearly a third of the way with water. In that profound cold, the water hadn't just frozen, it had become a singular monolithic block, a core of pure, immovable mass inside the plastic shell. That bin likely weighed over 700 pounds. Leo was whistling while he chipped ice off his windshield that morning. It was a tuneless, satisfied sound. The deep freeze held for a week. The transformed bin sat, a silent and formidable guardian. It became a talking point. People would walk their dogs a little out of their way to see it. The bunker, they started calling it. There was a collective unspoken hope that took root. We didn't wish for a crash. Not exactly. We wished for a reckoning. It came on a Saturday night. The roar of the Buick's failing muffler was a familiar annoyance. From my living room, I heard its unsteady progress down the alley, the engine revving too high, the tires spinning on patches of ice. I parted the blinds. The maroon boat weaved, its headlights painting drunken ellipses on the garage doors. It slowed near the bunker as if the driver finally noticed the bin's new, imposing stature. Perhaps he saw it as the ultimate challenge. The engine gunned. The sound that followed was not the crunch of plastic we were accustomed to. It was a deep, shuddering, organic thump, like a giant beating a carpet, followed immediately by the shriek of shearing metal and the crystalline rain of shattered glass. It was the sound of immutable physics meeting very mutable steel. I was out my back door in 30 seconds, parka thrown over my pajamas. The scene was one of brutal, almost comical justice. The Buick's front end was wrapped around the bin in a loving, catastrophic embrace. The hood was buckled into a perfect V. The radiator hissed, steam crystallizing instantly into a frosty fog around the wreck. The headlights popped from their sockets, lay in the snow like dazed fireflies. The bunker, however, hadn't budged. Not a centimeter. It stood utterly victorious, its yellow plastic uncracked, the block of ice within undoubtedly still frozen solid. The force had been transferred perfectly, completely back into the car's frame. The driver's door groaned open. A man in a denim jacket stumbled out, clutching his forehead. He wasn't badly hurt, just stunned into sobriety. He looked from his ruined car to the impassive bin and back again, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending astonishment. He walked around the front, touched the buckled fender, then reached out and pushed the bin. It was like pushing a building. The police arrived with gratifying speed. The officers, their faces grim and red from the cold, took in the scene. One of them, a sergeant with a frost-encrusted mustache, helped the day's driver to the cruiser. The other, a younger constable, walked over to the bunker. He placed both hands on it and shoved his full weight. It was laughably futile. He rapped his knuckles against the plastic. It gave a solid, resonant thunk. He looked from the bin to the wrecked Buick, and a slow, wide grin broke across his face. He caught my eye and Leo, standing a respectful distance away. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head, still grinning, and gave us a thumbs up. The arrest was procedural. The breathalyzer chirped its damning verdict. As they put the cuffs on, the driver found his voice. "That bin," he slurred, pointing a wobbly finger, "is a trap. You can't just fortify city property." The sergeant closed the cruiser door on his protests. "Tell it to the judge," he said, his voice muffled by the window. The tow truck's arrival was an hour-long spectacle of its own. The driver hooked its chains to the Buick's frame and gunned his winch. The car groaned but refused to detach from the bin. He tried yanking it from different angles. Finally, with a sound like a giant pulling a tooth, the Buick came free, leaving behind a streak of paint and a mangled piece of chrome trim embedded in the plastic. The tow truck driver then, for his own curiosity, tried to move the bunker. He wrapped chains around it and eased his truck forward. His tires spun helplessly on the ice. "Forget it, boys," he yelled, laughing. "That thing's part of the foundation now. You'll need a thaw and a crane." And so it remained for the rest of that indeterminable winter. The bunker stood as our neighborhood monument. The garbage trucks began to work around it, a quiet acknowledgement of its permanence. The story spread. People from other streets would come to look. Kids would dare each other to touch it. The black scar from the Buick became a badge of honor. Spring, when it finally deigned to arrive, was a slow and muddy affair. The ice within the bunker melted with glacial patience, shrinking away from the plastic walls over weeks. It wasn't until a warm day in May that a city works truck with a small crane on back arrived. A small crowd of us gathered to watch the operation with chains and the hydraulic whine of the crane. The bunker was finally lifted, dripping the last of its icy heart onto the asphalt, and laid gently on the truck. It looked small suddenly, just a dirty old bin. They dropped off a replacement, standard issue, virgin yellow. It looked flimsy, vulnerable. Leo, who was planting his early tomatoes in pots on his driveway, watched the new bin being placed. He wiped his hands on his pants and walked over to the spot where the bunker had stood for months. The asphalt was clean, bleached by the ice and scrubbed by the weather. He toed the ground with his boot. "Never had a problem after that, did we?" he said, more a statement than a question. He was right. Not a single bin was ever knocked over again. The legend of the bunker had permeated the alley, perhaps even reaching the patrons of the Aviator. The maroon Buick was never seen again. The beautiful part here is the total role reversal. For months, the bin was the victim and the car was the weapon. In that one instant, they swapped. The bin became the immovable object and the car became the fragile thing. The sound of the crash changes from a plastic crunch to a metal shred, and the driver's stunned reaction is priceless. He's used to breaking things and driving away. This time, he broke his own car on something that just stood there. His complaint that it was a trap is the cry of someone who's never faced a real consequence before. It wasn't a trap. It was just a harder version of the thing he kept choosing to hit. The aftermath is perfect community validation. The cop grins and gives a thumbs up. The tow truck driver can't even move the bin. The whole neighborhood adopts the bunker as a monument. And most importantly, the problem stops. And our next story. I survived a war with my HOA. I've owned my condo for over 30 years. When I originally bought it, most of the owners were original purchasers, and the association was stable, transparent, and uneventful. About 10 years ago, I moved out and began renting the unit. During that time, most of the original owners sold, leaving only a couple of them still active in the association. About 5 years ago, I received notice that the board was proposing some unusual bylaw changes. These included granting the board authority to spend up to 25% of the annual budget without owner approval and removing the requirement for an annual financial audit. Every alarm bell went off immediately. I attended the annual meeting where these changes were to be voted on and openly challenged them. The two remaining original owners had taken over the board and convinced newer owners that the board had near dictatorial authority. When I explained that these changes were unlawful and that the bylaws exist to protect owners, not strip their rights, the proposed changes were voted down. That was the moment my problems began. After that meeting, I started digging into association activities that occurred while I was an absentee owner I discovered that more than $100,000 had been spent on pet projects without owner approval. The same people were reelected to the board year after year with no competition. Concerned about my investment, I moved back into my condo and began talking to other residents. I was met with cold shoulders almost immediately. I later learned that I had been labeled a troublemaker. Despite being dismissed and ignored, I continued pointing out violations and irregularities. About a year later, my unit suffered extensive water damage. When I filed a claim through the association's insurance, the board denied responsibility and told me, "Your condo, your problem." The repairs were estimated at $20,000, money I didn't have. I had no choice but to file a lawsuit. Over the next 2 years, while fighting the HOA in court against attorneys paid by association insurance, I gained access to association records. What I found was far worse than I expected: election fraud, misappropriation of funds, and undisclosed spending. I reported this to authorities only to learn that government agencies generally refuse to intervene in HOA matters unless multiple owners file complaints. I was fighting alone, so nothing came of it. Eventually, my lawsuit stalled due to a technical issue I couldn't resolve. However, during that time, I uncovered something critical. The board had secretly hired an additional attorney and paid him using HOA funds. The board had told owners my lawsuit was frivolous and costing them nothing. I brought this information to one owner who occasionally listened to me. She confronted the board and discovered tens of thousands of dollars had been quietly spent while the court had already deemed the board's counterclaims frivolous. That revelation changed everything. The board tried to shut everyone out and insisted they had full authority to act without owner consent. This time, the owners didn't buy it. A members' meeting was canceled, and for the first time in years, people were willing to listen. I presented documentation showing election manipulation, financial abuse, and deliberate deception. The owners petitioned for a vote to remove the board. The board fought viciously, but it wasn't enough. The key members who'd hijacked the association were removed. The new board immediately fired the management company that had enabled the misconduct. The association paid for the repairs to my unit, and a committee was formed to rewrite the rules and regulations. I was appointed to that committee. Using the legal knowledge I'd gained through years of litigation, I personally rewrote the governing documents to ensure compliance with the law and prevent future abuse. Owners were granted veto power over major board actions. Financial transparency was restored. For the first time in years, pride began returning to a community that had been quietly stripped of it by a handful of controlling, manipulative individuals. The entire ordeal nearly broke me. It took an enormous emotional, physical, financial, and time toll. I do not recommend that a single condo owner take on a corrupt association the way I did. Most people lose badly unless they have competent legal representation. But for smaller issues, speaking up matters. Know your governing documents. Pay attention. Inform your neighbors when the board oversteps or neglects its duties. I was lucky. I survived the fight. And in the end, the beast was slain. Not by force, but by persistence, documentation, and the truth. There's an important warning embedded in this story that shouldn't be overlooked. Fighting an HOA alone is brutal and often dangerous financially. You're right to say you don't recommend it without support, but your experience also shows that silence is exactly what enables long-term abuse. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.